My name is Sophia Reed. I'm 34 years old, a mother of 5, living in a quiet town near Seville, Spain. If you had asked me 5 months ago, I would have told you my life was beautifully mundane, chaotic at times, but comfortingly predictable. I never could have imagined that February 17th, 2023 would shatter that normalcy forever. That was the day I died. And what I witnessed beyond the veil of this world changed me in ways I can barely begin to describe. It was one of those overcast Spanish winter mornings with rain drumming steadily against the windows and a chill creeping through the air. The house was alive with its usual morning madness. Children racing to find matching socks, half-packed school bags, spilling their contents across the floor, and my youngest whining about a homework assignment she had forgotten to finish. My stress simmered just beneath the surface, but I pushed forward, determined to hold the chaos together. As I hurried down the staircase, clutching my youngest's forgotten lunchbox in one hand and a mug of lukewarm coffee in the other, my foot missed a step. What happened next unfolded in an instant, though it felt like slow motion. Gravity yanked me down, the world spinning wildly around me. The edge of a step struck my back, sending a searing jolt of pain through my entire body. I felt every nerve screaming in protest as I tumbled, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if my entire existence was reduced to the sharp, blinding pain of that fall, but just as quickly it all stopped. There was silence. No pain, no sound. Just an eerie stillness that wrapped around me like a heavy blanket, freezing me to my core. It wasn't a comforting silence, it was the kind that seemed to stretch into eternity, vast and hollow. The next thing I remember was my husband, Ethan, cradling me in his arms. His body trembled, and his breath came in shallow gasps. "Stay with me, Sophia," he whispered, his voice raw with desperation. His words trembled like fragile glass, threatening to shatter under the weight of his fear. Rain streaked down his face, mingling with tears as he pressed his cheek against mine. His arms tightened around me, as if holding me close could somehow keep me tethered to this world. He carried me to the car, my body limp and unresponsive, as though it no longer belonged to me. The drive to the hospital was a blur. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the relentless rain, while the world outside became a distorted smear of red taillights and shadowy shapes. Ethan's voice cracked as he murmured frantic prayers under his breath, his gaze darting between the road and me. I tried to hold on, but I could feel it slipping, the connection to my body, my life, everything. An invisible force, cold and unyielding, was pulling me away. My breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps, each one feeling like a desperate struggle. An unbearable weight pressed down on my chest, and no matter how hard I fought, I couldn't resist the inevitable. And then it happened. One moment I was in the car, cocooned in Ethan's arms. The next, I was outside of it, looking at the scene from above. I saw my body motionless in the passenger seat. Ethan's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his face a mask of anguish and fear. His lips moved as he whispered prayers I could no longer hear. The rain poured down, streaking the car windows like tears, but I couldn't feel it. I felt nothing, no pain, no weight, no fear. I was free, weightless, and utterly disconnected from the life I had known. The world around me seemed sharper, more vivid, as if someone had adjusted the contrast on reality. Colours glowed with a surreal intensity, and yet everything felt strangely distant, like watching a masterpiece painting come to life from behind a pane of glass. Ethan's voice reached me as a faint echo, muffled and far away, like a sound carried across a great expanse of water. I reached out instinctively, wanting to comfort him, to tell him I was still there. But my hands passed through the air, insubstantial, as if I had become no more than a shadow. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of longing, a desperate desire to stay, to reach back across the chasm and cling to the life I had known. But the force pulling me was relentless. And then the world shifted. I reached out instinctively, desperate to touch him, to reassure him that I was still there. But my hand passed through him like vapor, and my voice dissolved into the air, lost and unheard. And then everything vanished. The rain, the car, my husband, it all dissolved into an endless expanse of radiant light. I stood in a place that no words could ever truly capture. The air itself shimmered with colors I had never seen before, hues that shifted and pulsed with a rhythm that felt alive. The ground beneath me wasn't solid, but thrummed with energy, as though it were part of some divine symphony. Despite the overwhelming beauty surrounding me, a deep unease coiled in my chest. I knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this wasn't a dream. It was more vivid, more real than anything I had ever known. Then I saw him. From the distance, a figure began to approach. His clothing shone with a brilliance that should have been blinding, yet instead it enveloped me in awe. There was a familiarity about him, as though I had known him forever but forgotten until this moment. Though I couldn't clearly see his face, his gaze pierced through me, leaving nothing hidden. Every thought, every fear, every secret was laid bare. "Sophia," he said, his voice resonating like the echo of a song I had always known but never understood. "You cannot stay here. There is something you must see, something you must tell." Before I could respond, the light around me began to dim. Shadows crept forward, swallowing the radiance. The world shifted, and a vision began to unfold before my eyes. What I saw will stay with me for the rest of my life. The dazzling beauty was replaced by an oppressive darkness, thick and suffocating, pressing down on me as though it could crush my very soul. Slowly, images began to emerge from the void, vivid and disturbingly clear. It felt as though I was standing before a vast living canvas, witnessing a world I no longer recognized. A date flashed before me, 2024. At first, the scenes were deceptively peaceful. Families sat together at dinner tables, children laughed as they played in parks, and the streets of Seville hummed with life. But the harmony didn't last. Cracks began to appear, not in the earth, but in the hearts of people. Tiny fractures, imperceptible at first, spread quickly, splintering relationships and dividing souls. Conflict erupted like a storm. Husbands turned on wives. Parents yelled at their children. Friends became enemies. This wasn't ordinary discord. It was a fierce, uncontrollable rage, a darkness that fed on the anger festering in people's hearts. Beneath it all, I saw chains, heavy, unyielding chains of bitterness and unforgiveness, binding people and tightening until they could no longer breathe freely. And then the first wave hit. A shadow swept across the world like an unstoppable tide, consuming everything in its path. Death struck without warning, tearing loved ones apart and leaving homes shrouded in silence. The grief was overwhelming, raw, and palpable, echoing through empty streets and broken hearts. Brilliant minds, doctors, artists, scientists were lost in their prime, their potential snatched away. Yet even in the mourning, bitterness lingered, clinging to humanity like a poison, and still there was light. In the midst of despair, small pockets of faith held firm. Groups of believers stood together, their prayers rising like flames against the encroaching darkness. Their light pushed back the shadow, though not without sacrifice. Every flicker of hope cost them dearly, yet they endured. The figure's voice broke through the vision, steady and unyielding. "You must tell them," he said, his tone resonating with both urgency and sorrow. "The time is shorter than they realize. They must prepare." Just as abruptly as the vision began, it shifted again, revealing the deeper truth. This was not random devastation. I could feel it. These were lives bound by chains of unforgiveness. People held tightly to their bitterness, locking themselves in prisons of their own making. I turned to the man in radiant white, my voice trembling as I struggled to find words. Why? Why is this happening? His face was a portrait of sorrow, etched with a grief that seemed infinite. Tears shimmered in his eyes, falling like droplets of light as he looked at me. "Unforgiveness," he said, his voice both mournful and resolute. "It is more than a wedge between people. It destroys the soul. It roots itself deeply, consuming everything it touches. In 2024, many will refuse to let it go. They will hold on to it until it consumes them, and death will follow. These chains are self-forged, and yet they refuse to break free." His words hung heavy in the air as the vision shifted once more, drawing me deeper into the unfolding tragedy. I saw hospitals bursting at the seams, their halls crowded with the sick and dying. The cries of anguish reverberated, haunting and relentless. Cities were veiled in a suffocating fog of grief, their lights dimmed by despair. Even the earth seemed to cry out, groaning under the weight of humanity's choices. Then came the catastrophes. Hurricanes ripped through coastlines, their winds carving destruction into the land. Earthquakes reduced entire cities to ruins, their tremors swallowing lives without mercy. Floodwaters surged with unstoppable force, engulfing towns and dragging away everything in their path. Fires raged uncontrollably, devouring forests, homes, and the lives of those who couldn't escape. The world itself seemed to unravel, its systems collapsing as if it could no longer bear the strain. And then I saw them. Lines of people stretched endlessly across a barren wasteland. The ground beneath them was cracked and lifeless, and the air felt heavy, pressing down like a weight on my chest. Their shoulders sagged under invisible burdens, their faces hollow and devoid of hope. They stood in silence, their eyes fixed downward, as though even looking ahead was too much to bear. "What is this place?" I whispered, my voice weak and shaking. The man in white turned his compassionate gaze toward them, his expression one of profound sorrow. "This is where souls come to give an account," he said, his tone reverent and solemn. Many of these people lived lives full of outward success, but their hearts remained hard. They clung to grudges, refused to forgive, and carried bitterness with them until it was too late. I watched as one by one these souls stepped forward, each facing a moment of reckoning. Their sorrow was unbearable, heavy in the air as they saw their lives unfold before them with perfect clarity. Missed opportunities to love, rejected chances to forgive, moments of grace ignored. All of it played out before them like an unending reel of regret. The scene shifted abruptly, and I found myself in a place so harrowing it defied explanation. It wasn't the fire that struck me most, though it burned fiercely. It was the overwhelming, suffocating presence of hopelessness. Regret had taken on a life of its own, wrapping itself around the souls like chains, binding them in anguish. Their cries pierced the air, endless and haunting, filled with a sorrow so profound it felt like it might tear the world apart. I understood then. These were the souls of those who had chosen hatred over love, pride over humility, and bitterness over forgiveness. The man in white wept openly, his tears falling like streams of light, each one carrying the weight of his love and sorrow. "This is not my desire for them," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "But choices have consequences, and love cannot force its way into a heart that refuses to let it in." The urgency within me was unbearable, rising like a tide that threatened to overwhelm me. "This cannot happen!" I wanted to scream, to plead, to beg for it all to stop. But before I could speak, the vision shifted one final time. This time it was different. Light pierced the darkness, steady and unyielding, like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long and suffocating night. People knelt in prayer, tears streaming down their faces as they cried out for forgiveness. Families once fractured by pride and resentment embraced with trembling arms, releasing the burdens they had carried for years. Communities came together, their divisions healed by humility and love. The light grew stronger, illuminating their faces, lifting the chains that had bound their hearts. This was hope, fragile, yet unbreakable, like a seed taking root in barren soil. Faces once hardened by bitterness now seemed to glow with a serenity that transcended words, their humility radiating like beacons piercing through the darkest storm. The transformation was undeniable, as though a divine hand had reached into their hearts and replaced pride with peace. "The future is not set," the man said, his voice reverberating with an authority that silenced everything around me. "This is why you must go back. Tell them what you have seen. Warn them. Time is shorter than they realize." A longing to stay gripped me, overwhelming and consuming. The peace here was beyond comprehension, enveloping me like the softest embrace, as if the very essence of this place was love itself. It was a world without fear, without doubt, yet I knew what he said was true. He looked at me with eyes that held the weight of eternity, filled with love so vast it felt infinite, yet laced with urgency. "Sophia Reed," he said, my name resonating like a sacred echo, vibrating through every part of me. "Your mission is far from over. Call them to forgiveness, to love, to truth. The world depends on it." Before I could reply, the light wrapped around me like a protective cocoon, pulling me away. I felt myself moving, being drawn back toward the world I had left behind, the warmth of that place fading, but leaving its mark on my soul. When I opened my eyes, I was greeted by the sterile glow of hospital lights. The rhythmic beeping of monitors filled the room, grounding me in a reality that felt both familiar and foreign. My chest felt heavy, not from physical pain, but from the immense burden of what I had just witnessed. Through the blur of tears, I saw Ethan and my children standing nearby, their faces etched with a mixture of fear, relief, and a love so fierce it almost broke me. They reached out, holding my hands as though afraid I might slip away again. Tears streamed down my cheeks as a tidal wave of emotions surged within me. I had been given a second chance, not just to live, but to bring change, to carry the message that had been entrusted to me. The days that followed were surreal, as though I was suspended between two worlds. The hospital room became a fragile sanctuary, shielding me from the enormity of what I had seen. Yet even in the stillness, the echoes of 2024 haunted me. I couldn't shake the images of those left behind, consumed by regret. And the weight of his words urging me to share what I had witnessed burned like an unquenchable fire in my chest. When I was finally discharged, I left the hospital knowing one thing with absolute certainty: my life would never, ever be the same. Ethan drove me home in silence, his eyes flicking toward me now and then, as if checking to make sure I was still there. Relief softened the lines on his face, but tension lingered in his knuckles, gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the faint glow of streetlights. The silence wasn't awkward but charged, filled with questions neither of us were ready to ask. That night, after the kids were asleep and the house settled into its quiet rhythm, Ethan and I sat across from each other at the dining table. The hum of the refrigerator seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. My hands wrapped around a mug of tea, trembling slightly as I sought to ground myself in the moment. "Ethan," I began, my voice barely a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you." Slowly, carefully, I began to recount everything, the visions, the overwhelming presence of the man clothed in radiant white, the words that had pierced my soul, and the things I had seen that would haunt me forever. As I spoke, Ethan's expression shifted from disbelief to awe and then to something deeper, a mix of fear and resolve. His hands reached across the table to clasp mine, gripping tightly as though anchoring himself to my words. When I finished, the silence that followed felt as heavy as the story I had shared. Ethan leaned forward, his voice low but steady, laced with the weight of understanding. "Sophia," he said, his tone soft but resolute, "how do we even begin to tell people something like this?" Tears welled in my eyes and I squeezed his hands, willing my voice not to falter. "We start with us," I said, my words trembling with both vulnerability and conviction. "We forgive. We let go of the grudges we've held on to for far too long. We love each other with everything we have. And then we share it with anyone who will listen. Ethan, we can't keep this to ourselves. People need to know." The next morning, I woke before dawn, the house still cloaked in the quiet of early morning. The weight of the mission pressed heavily on my chest, yet my heart was resolute. Kneeling by my bed, I poured out my fears and hopes in prayer, every word raw and unfiltered. "God," I whispered, "I'm scared. I don't know if I'm strong enough, but I'm willing. Show me the way." As I prayed, a quiet strength began to rise within me. Gratitude swelled alongside it, gratitude for the second chance I had been given, not just to live, but to bring hope and transformation to the lives of others. I knew exactly where I needed to begin, with the people I loved most. "God, I can't do this on my own," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of everything I had seen. "I need your strength, your wisdom, your guidance to walk this path." As the words left my lips, a stillness settled over me and slowly a quiet resolve began to grow. Gratitude filled my heart, pushing back the fear. I had been given a second chance, a chance to live, to love, and to repair the fractures in my own life and perhaps in the lives of others. In the depths of my soul, I could still hear Jesus' words echoing like a sacred command. "Tell them what you have seen." I knew where I had to start. With my family, it wasn't easy. The wounds in our relationships weren't fresh. They were scars, buried deep beneath years of silence, misunderstandings, and pride. But I knew what was at stake. One by one, I made the calls I had avoided for years. My hands shook as I dialed the numbers and my voice cracked as I spoke. I didn't make excuses, didn't try to justify the past. I simply apologized, genuinely, deeply, with no regard for who had been right or wrong. What happened next caught me off guard. My siblings, once distant and guarded, broke down in tears. My parents, whose words had grown cold over time, softened in ways I hadn't seen in years. The walls between us didn't crumble all at once, but brick by brick they began to fall. Healing wasn't perfect, it rarely is, but it was a start, a glimmer of what forgiveness could do when hearts were willing to open. That was only the beginning. The next step was far more daunting, sharing the message with the world. Doubts crept in, whispering incessantly in the back of my mind. Who am I to do this, I thought. I'm not a preacher, I'm not a writer, I'm just a 34-year-old mother from Seville. But then I remembered something I'd once heard. God doesn't call the equipped, He equips the called. Clinging to that truth, I took a leap of faith. I began speaking at small local churches, sharing my testimony with anyone willing to listen. At first, I was terrified. My hands shook, my voice wavered, and my words felt clumsy and inadequate. But then something unexpected began to happen. People didn't just hear my story, they felt it. Tears streamed down their faces as they confronted their own pain, their own grudges and regrets. After each service, strangers approached me with trembling voices and tear-filled eyes. They shared their struggles, confessed to estranged relationships, and vowed to make amends. But not everyone welcomed the message. Some dismissed me outright, scoffing at my story. A few even mocked me, their laughter sharp and cutting. There were moments when the rejection felt unbearable, when I wanted nothing more than to retreat into silence and let the weight of it all crush me. But in those moments, I remembered the man in white. I remembered the tears in his eyes, the love in his voice, and the unwavering urgency of his words. He wasn't asking for perfection, he was asking for obedience. One night, as I prepared to speak at another church, the doubts crept in again, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. I knelt beside my bed, tears spilling freely as I buried my face in my hands. God, I whispered, my voice breaking, I can't do this. It's too much for me. I'm not strong enough. In the silence, his words came back to me, clear and steady. Tell them what you have seen. Something shifted in me that night. When I stood before the congregation, I felt a boldness that wasn't my own. My voice was steady, and the words flowed with a clarity I hadn't experienced before. 2025 is not just a warning, I declared, scanning the crowd with a conviction that burned within me. It's an opportunity, a chance to forgive, to love, and to return to God before it's too late. Yes, what I saw was terrifying, but it wasn't the end of the story. There is hope. There is always hope. The room fell silent, the air thick with emotion. No one stirred, no one looked away. It was as though every heart in that room had been cracked open, the walls of bitterness and pride crumbling in the face of truth. Looking back now, I understand that the visions of 2025 weren't just for me. They were for all of us, a wake-up call to confront the anger, pride, and unforgiveness that poison our souls. But they were also a reminder that it's never too late. We can rewrite the story with love, grace, and humility. I don't have all the answers. I don't know every detail of what's to come, but I do know this. The same God who revealed those visions is the same God who offers redemption and hope. And as long as I have breath in my lungs, I will keep sharing his message. One heart, one soul, one life at a time. Now, I ask you, yes, you, reading or hearing these words, will you release the bitterness, the pain, the grudges you've carried for far too long? Will you choose forgiveness, love, and the peace that only Jesus can give? The choice is yours. The time is now. Let's face 2025 together, not with fear, but with faith.